lecture by the esteemed Dr. Christian W. McMillen from the University of Virginia, Virginia. Before we begin, let us have a moment of silence. Thank you. My name is Nainu Umman, and I'm joined by my colleague, Nikhil Tony, who will read out a few instructions for the smooth conduct of the program.
Thank you so much, Nainu. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So let me draw your attention to a very few instructions that are to be kindly noted by the participants, even though you are pretty much familiar with it. So please do cooperate to ensure an efficient and satisfactory session. So firstly, unless you have a question to ask, you are kindly requested not to introduce yourself with the name and address in the chat box, because it might cause some distractions to the speaker. Secondly, all the queries that are intended for the Q&A session are to be dropped in the chat box, addressing it to everyone when the chat box is opened. And finally, a feedback form will be posted at the end of the lecture. So concisely, that's all about the instructions. We request your endorsement and encouragement through the active participation. Thank you. Over to you, Nainu.
Thank you, Nikhil. Now I invite Dr. Raju Sebastian, Assistant Professor at the English Department, to deliver the welcome speech and introduce the speaker for the evening.
Respected Professor Christian W. McMillen, Speaker of the Day, our Head of the Department, Professor P.J. Thomas, conveners of this webinar, Mr. Nitin Varghese and Anish K. Joseph, and esteemed participants from across the world. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to you all. I feel privileged when I am asked to welcome you all to the sixth edition of the International Webinar Series on Stories, Storytellings, and Methods. Today we have a talk most relevant to our own times: epidemics and history. And we have one of the most eminent scholars in the world to talk about this, Professor Christian W. McMillen from the University of Virginia, United States. As some of us might know, Professor McMillen is Associate Dean of Social Sciences and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He took his PhD from the prestigious Yale University in 2004 and got trained in epidemiology at the famous Johns Hopkins University from 2010 to 12. An expert and a frontline researcher in ethnography, especially American natives, and world health, especially epidemics, from the point of view of a social scientist. Professor McMillen has published 3 important books. And the first one is in ethnography, which has won 3 important awards. The title of the book is Making Indian Law, the Hualapai Case and the Birth of Ethnohistory. It has won 2 important awards from the area of history, from the field of, law, and 1 from ethnography. And the other 2 books are related to world health, that is Pandemics, a very short introduction. That is the latest book that is part of the prestigious Oxford University very short introduction series, came out in 2016. And Discovering Tuberculosis, a Global History, published by Yale University in 2015. He has got 11 peer-reviewed articles, 22 invited. He has given 22 invited talks in various symposia and conferences, and has got 32 research grants to his credits. These credentials of Dr. McMillen make his a much awaited one. We have heard a lot about epidemics and pandemics from the medical experts these days, but it is a golden opportunity for us to listen to it, to look at this phenomena from the point of view of a social scientist. On behalf of St. Berchmans College and all the esteemed participants of this webinar, let me welcome Professor Dr. Christian W. McMillen to the sixth edition of the International Webinar Series on Stories and Storytelling. Let me also accord a very cordial welcome to our visionary HOD, Professor P.J. Thomas, our Vice Principal, Dr. Benny Matthew, our dynamic and brilliant conveners, Nathan Verghese and Anish K. Joseph, distinguished professors of the department and other departments of the college, other distinguished professors of colleges and universities, other universities, and all the dignitaries and students attending this webinar. I wish all of you a very fruitful time ahead. Thank you. Over to you, Professor McMillen.
My apologies. I lost my internet was bad for a moment, and I lost some of the introduction, but I caught almost all of it. Thank you so much for the extremely kind introduction. I'm really, really grateful. I'm really, really happy to be here too, and thank you for allowing me to do this on a schedule that was that worked well for all of us. I know it's early in the morning here and late in the day in South India. So what I'll do in a moment is I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to turn my video off while I'm talking. That way you can concentrate on the slides and you don't need to see me while I'm talking, but I'll be here. And then as soon as I'm done talking, I'll turn the video back on. And then as I understand it, there'll be maybe 15 minutes or so of questions. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me turn my video off, and I'll share my screen, and I'll see you shortly. And again, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm sorry I missed the last maybe 30 seconds or so. I got kicked off Zoom and had to get back on. So anyway, thanks again. And Nitin, thank you so much for doing all the organization. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So again, thanks so much for coming. I'm really happy to be here. I've been to South India once with my family to Kochi and other parts of Kerala 4 years ago with my wife and my 2 children, and we just had a wonderful time. I wish I could be there in person rather than halfway around the world, but Zoom is quite remarkable. So I'm glad I'm able to be here. So what I thought I would do is I'm going to talk in very general terms about the history of epidemic disease and why it's important. Why do historians study such things? Why do we find them endlessly fascinating? And what are some of the biggest themes in the history of infectious disease? For several years now, more than several years now, I've been teaching a course called Epidemics, Pandemics, and History. And teaching that course has given me a chance, while working with students, sharing some of these ideas with them over the years, to reflect on what I see as the most important about the history of infectious disease. Because of my current job as Associate Dean, I don't teach that class right now. And so it's a real treat to be able to talk about it. So why do historians study such things? Why do historians find disease fascinating? One of the best answers comes from one of my favorite books. It's an anthology of essays on the history of infectious disease. And in the introduction, 2 historians write that epidemics are especially susceptible to comparative study because they are common to all continents and cultures. They raise particularly broad issues in the history of ideas because they support, test, undermine, or reshape religions, social and political, as well as medical assumptions and attitudes. Past epidemics throw a sharp light on the ideologies and mentalities of the societies they afflicted. Now, of course, the same could be said about the present. In other words, epidemics and pandemics tell us a lot about ourselves, what our values are, what we hold important. They show us fractures in our society. They show us where our societies might be strongest. In the history of epidemic disease, there are several themes that really characterize this history and that kind of really run through the history of epidemic disease as far back as one wishes to probe. The first is twofold. The natural or non-human world has had a powerful effect on the human world. By the same token, there's not necessarily anything natural about why infectious diseases affect one place and not another. Second, and I'll elaborate on all of these in one way or another in a little bit, ideas are powerful. The way we think about epidemic disease, the way we explain them. Third, an over-reliance on technology and biomedicine to the exclusion of social forces has often resulted in overconfident and unrealistic promises about the demise of disease. You can see that in the current coronavirus. Of course, we need to wait for a vaccine. Of course, we need, of course, a vaccine will be an enormous help, as will therapeutics. But we have lots of social measures we can take to prevent transmission of the disease. Fourth, epidemics have a disproportionate effect on the poor, an observation intimately related to the other three themes. Pandemics and epidemics have long linked the world. That is, they travel. Epidemic diseases affect every single part of the planet. One historian has called the period between the Black Death in the 14th century and the arrival of epidemics in the New World, in what's now the United States. He called this period the unification of the globe by disease. We still live in that time. We can see it at a rapidly accelerated right now as the coronavirus has unified the globe through a disease. For what I want to do today, as I noted, is to touch to varying degrees on each of these themes. First, the study of infectious disease allows historians to explore the ways in which the natural world has had a powerful effect on the human world. As environmental historians have been arguing for decades, non-human actors are important. At the same time, and this is the point I want to illustrate, we must keep in mind that there's little that's natural about diseases affecting some places and not others. Historians of infectious disease endeavor to explore the human side of what might appear to be simply, natural or biological events. I'll explain these slides in a moment. Was it a natural event, for example, that allowed the mass depopulation of the Americas between the 15th and the 18th centuries? No, it wasn't. As David Arnold wrote about cholera in his superb history of infectious diseases in 19th century India, he wrote, like any other disease, cholera itself has no meaning. It is only a microorganism. It acquires meaning and significance from its human context, from the ways in which it infiltrates the lives of the people, from the reactions it provokes, and from the manner in which it gives expression to cultural and political values. Just as our values give meaning to microorganisms, the conditions that give rise to epidemic and pandemics only occur within particular historical context. And thus infectious diseases only emerge as epidemics when particular social and biological conditions are present. I want to just offer a brief example from current research I'm doing on the history of water. Beginning in the 1920s, the Blue Nile region of Sudan, you can see it here on the map, has been home to the largest irrigated agricultural project on the planet. Introducing so much water introduced mosquitoes, which brought malaria, and snails, which brought schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease. The project also created a migrant labor force that helped to spread and perpetuate disease. You can see in the slides the malaria positivity rates, and you can see the map of roughly where this is in Sudan. Population movements due to labor migrations have been a well-known factor in the creation and spread of epidemics, and particularly in Africa. The introduction of water in this part of Sudan created an entirely new landscape. The Sudanese doctor in charge of what became the Blue Nile Health Project wrote that, quote, water and its agricultural, domestic, and recreational uses is the major single environmental factor in malaria, bilharzia, gastrointestinal diseases, and other vector-borne infections. While malaria and schistosomiasis are now in this region, for all intents and purposes, features of the natural landscape, their presence is entirely the result of historical human activity, as many observers are arguing about the coronavirus now. That it has seeped into the human population as a result of human activity. It's not a natural event. It is an event that is symbolic of the relationship between the human and the natural world. In the Sudan, for decades, little to nothing was done to mitigate the dire consequences of water development. But beginning in the late 1980s and continuing through the 70s rather, and continuing through the 80s and into the 90s, the World Bank and the WHO, in partnership with the Sudanese government, attempted to mitigate the effects of such large-scale irrigation projects. They did so because, as one bank official put it, there was in fact a moral component to irrigation development. I'm going to read a brief quote. This is a profound realization of the ways in which human actions have altered the natural environment to create an entirely new disease landscape. He wrote, interventions which are known to increase substantially the spread of serious disease cannot be undertaken lightly. If they are embarked upon, lenders would seem to be morally obligated not only to institute effective countermeasures to offset these dangers, but to reduce the remarkable increase in waterborne diseases that, for example, the irrigation schemes in Sudan have produced. The point is relatively simple. Conditions that give rise to epidemic disease occur only within particular historical contexts, and thus infectious diseases only emerge as epidemics when particular social and biological conditions are present. But they are only mitigated, on the other hand, when people realize that they are not, in fact, natural events. There are many reasons, for example, why cholera appeared on the world stage in the 19th century. British colonialism in India, which increased travel and trade between the East and the West, far faster travel by ship and the opening of the Suez Canal, increased urbanization across Europe. The reasons go on and on. While influenza's lethal effects in 1918 were surely because of the strain's peculiar virulence, it could not have spread as it did even 20 years previously. For one, the rail and shipping lines, to say nothing of the migrations and deprivations caused by World War I, were not yet in place. One historian has written that, quote, the nature of the 1918-1919 disease agent was such that influenza seemed to rage through sub-Saharan Africa as though the colonial transportation network had been planned for the pandemic. The same was true for AIDS in the 1970s and 80s. It arrived when it did for reasons peculiar to the times, revolving mostly around migrations to and from Central Africa to the Caribbean. Indeed, the transportation and trade networks that helped the flu spread in 1918 also facilitated the movement of HIV/AIDS across the continent later in the country. The same could be said of the coronavirus now. The conditions that have been in place since the Black Death in the 1340s, that is a world interconnected by trade, are still present. They're just moving at a much faster pace. The broad point might be obvious, but it's one I want to stress. Epidemic diseases do not occur outside of a human context. This is why understanding their history is so obviously important. The map is a map. The map on the right, rather, my right is or my left, rather. Sorry, is a map of the way in which AIDS traveled through Africa, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, across the 20th century. And the one on the right is a map from the middle of the 19th century, or rather the late 19th century, in the 1880s. And if you can't read it, it says actual and supposed routes of cholera from Hindustan, which some people called India at the time, to Europe. anyway, a map of how cholera traveled across the world in the 19th century. These are some slides of connecting the presence of cholera in water, mostly in England. A second major theme in the history of epidemic disease is that they disproportionately affect the poor and the marginalized. We see this with in these two slides, particularly with Venezuela and malaria, as the Venezuelan economy collapsed and more people moved into to mining, malaria increased. The history of pandemics and epidemics is intimately tied to the history of inequality, economic exploitation, and marginalization. Paul Farmer, who is one of the co-founders of Partners in Health, has called diseases like TB, quote, biological expressions of social inequality. Hundreds of years ago, this observation was made in Marseille, France, 1720, as the plague raged through the city. A doctor said the following about a neighborhood spared of the pestilence. He wrote that the streets are wide, the houses large, and inhabited chiefly by persons living in a state of opulence. And such are always the last attacked by a contagion on account of the means they have to place themselves out of its reach. This quote about Marseille, France in 1720 could just as easily be a quote about almost anywhere in the world in 2020. Those of us who are able to keep ourselves out of the reach of the coronavirus, those of us who are able to isolate and work from home and stay away from places where it's most rampant, are the ones who are going to be most free from coronavirus. The opposite is the case for those that cannot. We will return to the link between poverty and disease later when looking at tuberculosis a little more carefully. These are some slides on the left and the right, in between the pamphlet in the middle, are costumes that were publicized and popularized in England in the middle of the 19th century, ways in which you could keep cholera away from you. And I'll come back to the meaning of these slides in a little bit, but they're generally there to illustrate this notion that no one really knew what cholera was, no one knew how to ward it off, and so all sorts of ideas about what cholera was and how to prevent it and how to keep oneself safe from it circulated throughout Europe and England. These are slides that some of you may know some of this history. It's an unfortunate history. It's a racist history. It's an ethnocentric history in England and America, blaming migrants, particularly from India, for the presence of cholera in the United States and America. These are also from the 19th century. The one on the right or the one on the left, rather, I'm sorry, is from England, from New York, the harbor of New York, and the one on the right is from England. Just like in current times, Americans in particular, the British as well, blamed outsiders for their problems of disease, and used the specter of disease to vilify outsiders, to vilify immigrants. And for that reason, it's also critically important to understand ideas. It's important to understand how ideas have changed dramatically over time, and to understand how it is the way people think about disease is is one of the most important things to understand in our reaction to disease. Now, ideas, the word ideas, of course, is a pretty capacious one. So I want to look at a couple of explanations of who gets sick and why. How have we explained why some people have gotten sick and others, have not? Now, these explanations have depended very often on beliefs embedded in a given society's values. For a time, especially prominent was the notion that epidemics were the result of divine providence, that is, God's will, and only prayer and faith could ward off disease. Before plague reached him, Ralph of Shrewsbury, who was the bishop of Bath and Wells in England, implored his flock to pray. Towards the end of the summer of 1348, during the Black Death, He wrote, "Since a catastrophic pestilence from the east has arrived in a neighboring kingdom, it is very much to be feared that unless we pray devoutly and incessantly, a similar pestilence will stretch its poisonous branches into this realm and strike down and consume its inhabitants." In one of the most detailed contemporary explanations of the Black Death, the masters of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris wrote in October 1348 that, quote, "the distant and first cause of this pestilence was and is the configuration of the heavens." They believe that when Jupiter and Mars, in particular, came together, this caused, quote, "a great pestilence in the air." Jupiter drew vapors out of the earth and Mars ignited them. Now, even with this scientific explanation, scientific for the time, people don't believe this now, but it was one at the time, in any case, driven by observation and theory. Plague, however, was still ultimately thought to be caused by God. They wrote, "We must not overlook the fact that any pestilence proceeds from the divine will, and all our advice can therefore only be to return humbly to God." Plague repeatedly visited England between 1348 and 1665. To some, more than 300 years of constant visitation from a force no one could explain, and which came and went seemingly without rhyme or reason, could only be the work of God. Explanations other than divine providence had so many holes in them, such as suggesting plague was a warm season phenomenon and then having it come in winter, that resorting to God was common. In 1598, a British preacher, when reflecting on a recent outbreak of bubonic plague, wrote the following, quote, "It was not infection of the air, distemperature in men's bodies, much less the malicious and devilish practice of witches, or yet blind fortune, or any other such imagined causes, which were the breeders of these evils, but the mass and the multitude of our sins." A poet wrote the following around the same time, very briefly, quote, "Only this antidote apply, cease vexing heaven and cease to die." Now in North America, the demographic collapse of American Indians was also, especially in the 17th century, thought to be the work of God. In 1634, the Jesuit priests wrote of the conditions prevailing in the northern part of what is now the United States. "Disease, war, and famine are the three scourges with which God has been pleased to smite our neophytes since they have commenced to adore him and submit to his laws. All these events have so greatly thinned the number of our savages that where 8 years ago one could see 80 or 100 cabins, barely 5 or 6 can now be seen. A captain who then had 800 warriors under his command has not more than 30 or 40. Instead of fleets of 300 or 400 canoes, we now see but 20 or 30. In reflecting on the causes of a major pre-settlement epidemic of 1616 to 1619 in Massachusetts, that's on the east coast of the United States, one colonist wrote in 1620, "Within these late years, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, together with many horrible slaughters and murders committed amongst the savages, in a manner to the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of the whole territory." He went on, "We in our judgment are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come, in which Almighty God in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, meaning Native American people, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects and people." Finally, William Bradford, a reasonably well-known colonist in the history of early America, wrote of the demise of the Indian peoples in Massachusetts in 1634, when approximately 90% of the population died. He wrote, "God hath cleared our title." And what that means, at least in Anglo-American law, is that now that the original inhabitants are gone, and it was God's will that they be gone, title to that land would now transfer to the English. So while providential explanations have diminished over time, God does occasionally still appear as an explanation for epidemic disease, as it did when Jerry Falwell, an American evangelical minister, said the following in 1993. AIDS is not just God's punishment of homosexuals, it is God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals. But the diminishing importance of providence, of course, did not mean it was replaced with anything more solid. Uncertainty still prevailed. For example, when cholera first made its way to England in the 1830s, medical theory was chaotic. As you see here in this slide again, people knew so little about cholera that they dressed themselves up. I mean, of course, not everybody in the streets was dressed up in these things, but it's to give you a sense of the ways in which people thought about diseases, that all sorts of herbs and costumes and so forth would keep you free of cholera. One observer writing in The Lancet, the British medical journal that's still published today, at the time summed things up this way. The progress of medicine as an inductive science is retarded by the construction of hypothetical theories or the assumption of principles which are altogether gratuitous and imaginary, and also by the deduction of general principles or conclusions from a limited number of facts. In other words, people didn't know anything. In 1832, a medical professor at the Yale School of Medicine wrote the following about cholera. If I am asked about the essential non-contagious nature of cholera, I answer frankly, I do not know. Every agent in nature, real or imaginary, has been accused. Electricity, magnetism, earth, air, water, sun, the moon, planets, comets have each been arraigned in vain. There is a musty air which hangs over the origin and spread of epidemics, which will probably never be removed. The philosophers of the present day are no wiser on this subject than those who lived 3,000 years ago. So in the middle of the 19th century, when diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, plague less so by this time, but many other infectious diseases were extraordinary causes of mortality and sickness. Smallpox was another. Very few people actually had explanations for why these diseases were so deadly, much less any explanation of what could be done about them. There were no effective therapeutics, and of course, antibiotics wouldn't be invented for another 100 years. But then, in the middle of the 19th century, change came quickly and dramatically. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during what's come to be called the laboratory revolution, the microscopic causes of many infectious diseases like tuberculosis and cholera were discovered. And for the very first time, people were able to see the actual diseases that inhabited their bodies. Discovering the plague bacillus in 1894, for instance, put to rest centuries of debate over the causes of the plague. That one could now see and explain the microscopic entities that caused infectious diseases changed the face of medicine like nothing else in the previous millennium or more. In less than a generation, many of the mysteries of disease had been solved. So-called magic bullets could be used to kill off germs. Now, in the United States and in parts of Western Europe, these ideas made their way into popular culture. The slides here are the one on the far left is of a book called The Microbe Hunters, which I believe in the United States is still in print. It was one of the most popular books of the 20th century. These two movies, the story of Louis Pasteur and Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, were popular Hollywood movies in the 1930s, suggesting, of course, the extraordinary popularity of this notion of magic bullets, but also showing that doctors and their cures and the ways in which they approach medicine have become part of popular culture. So even though, however, the microscopic causes of diseases have been discovered, ideas about disease still prevail. That is to say, the fact that scientific explanations for disease, rather observation of disease, were present, it was still really what people thought and what people believed that guided how they approached disease. Let's look at tuberculosis just for a little bit and I can illustrate this point. By the turn of the 20th century, it was widely accepted that the tubercle bacillus caused tuberculosis. One could see it under a microscope. Few disputed that the presence of the bacillus meant that one was infected with tuberculosis. But ideas about who became infected and why reflected social norms, values, and attitudes. And I want to look at race for a moment, as it provided an explanation for why tuberculosis affected some and not others. It was an explanation that relied, in a way, on faith and long-held beliefs about race, particularly in America, but also in other places around the world. The notion that one's race was essential to understanding who did and did not get TB was based not on research, but on the ways in which people made medical observations to fit their predetermined views. At the time in which these views emerged in the United States, it was a time when racial ideas were embedded in American culture, and a very, very simplistic view of race prevailed. The editor of the American Review of Tuberculosis wrote in the middle of the 1920s on the question of racial susceptibility, in a quote that I think sums up perfectly some of my own points. He wrote that, and I really love this quote. He said, out of a single fact, now that single fact is that there are people, such as American Indians, who might have more TB than others. He wrote, out of a single fact, numerous writers have built up a rather stiff doctrine that avers an exceptional lack of innate resistance of primitive peoples to tuberculosis. The basic fact, is the common observation that the introduction of tuberculosis among less civilized populations is followed by excessive mortality. Now, of course, he's using language that we wouldn't use today. He wrote, the fact is conceded, the conclusion stated is not yet denied. Yet it is submitted that it need not follow from the premise, and it is maintained that the premise does not prove it. What he was trying to say, rather, is that this is an example of circular reasoning. People were using their beliefs about race to give themselves an explanation of their observations. He exposed what was at the heart of just about all writing concerning so-called primitive people and tuberculosis, a series of assumptions based on a readily obvious observation that led to a conclusion that no one had actually proven. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, just as new research was revealing the causes of disease, European colonial expansion into Africa and the mass movement of American Indians to reservations were at their height. These two things were happening at the same time, and it's very important for understanding how people thought about tuberculosis. So while it's a great oversimplification, it is nonetheless not inaccurate to say that both of these things resulted in setting off a wave of tuberculosis epidemics. That is, the European movement into Africa and the mass movement of American Indians to reservations. But why, to many observers at the time, were Black Africans and American Indians so seemingly susceptible to tuberculosis? In short, for many, it was their race. On the Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation in 1900, the doctor declared that, quote, the greater physical weakness of the American Indian, I want to stress, is inherent in his being. Thus, the explanation for the disease remained natural, but had gone from God's will to being American Indians' racial inferiority. R.G. Ferguson, who was a Canadian TB specialist in charge of the country's efforts to control tuberculosis among First Nations peoples, wrote in 1929 that, quote, race appears to outshadow any effect of predisposing factors, such as food, housing, and sanitation, in survival and recession of the epidemic. In South Africa, it was long thought that Black South Africans were uniquely susceptible to tuberculosis, and the explanation was racial. Preventive measures were futile. Evolution could not be sped up. Races need to become what was called at the time tubercularized. And what that meant was that whole groups of people were thought to be either A, susceptible, or B, unsusceptible to tuberculosis. And so once TB was in a population, and a certain number of that population got tuberculosis and recovered, the people who recovered, in other words, didn't die, would be now immune to tuberculosis, and on a population level, they would become tubercularized. So in this way of thinking in the 1930s, for example, Anglos in England had become tubercularized because they had lived through a TB epidemic in the 19th century or even the 18th century. This is a completely outmoded way of thinking, but at the time it was very, very prevalent. So American Indians, for example, or Black South Africans, for whom TB was a relatively new disease, hadn't on a population level become tubercularized. Now, not everyone agreed with this idea at the time. And two men exemplified the vigorous debate being had by the 1930s over the question of racial susceptibility. A man named Basil Dormer and another named Lyle Cummins. Lyle Cummins was a Welsh tuberculosis specialist and a prominent believer in racial theories of disease. He was also extremely influential in the ways in which South Africa approached their tuberculosis problem, having been a consultant to the Chamber of Mines in South Africa. He wrote, "Behind the child type of tuberculosis seen in Africans lies a real inborn lack of power to develop resistance to tuberculosis lesions commonly observed in Europeans. The balance of evidence points to what he said was a biological dissimilarity in the average response to tuberculosis infection as between Black and white races." Basil Dormer, who eventually became the chief TB officer of South Africa in the 1940s, he wrote, or rather he focused on the social conditions that Black South Africans occupied. He wrote, "It is stated in all the books that primitive races are more susceptible and less resistant to tuberculosis than the so-called civilized people. The disease," he observed, "tends to run a much more rapid course in primitive people. And this is ascribed to a racial susceptibility or a lack of racial resistance. We are loath to subscribe to this." Race, he and his colleagues emphatically stated, was not a factor in one's susceptibility to tuberculosis. He wrote, "We believe that if we exposed Europeans to the same degree of malnutrition and sustained physical effort as native South Africans, they would succumb to the identical type of disease." He went on, "Proper precautionary measures must be adopted. The fatalistic attitude which explains the severity of Bantu tuberculosis on the basis of racial susceptibility should be abandoned. The real causes are clear and can be remedied." Now, this last point I want to highlight, where he wrote the fatalistic attitude and the real causes are clear and can be remedied. What he's referencing and why he's making that point in particular is that this notion of tubercularization and the notions that someone like Lyle Cummins possessed, that biological dissimilarity was inherent in their being, meant that very few people who believed that the way he believed, the way Cummins believed, thought that anything could be done about tuberculosis in Black South Africans, that they were fated to die and then become tubercularized. What Dormer is saying is that no, not at all. We have put them in conditions that make them susceptible to tuberculosis. Precautionary measures must be adopted. We cannot be fatalistic about it. As he said, the real causes are clear and can be remedied. And to him, the real causes were poverty, overwork, and malnutrition. By the middle of the 1930s, the relationship between tuberculosis and poverty, to many, had become more and more apparent. In Manitoba, Canada, one doctor reported in 1936 that, quote, "We have been accustomed to think of Indians, American Indians, lack of resistance to tuberculosis as entirely racial." But he recognized that ideas were changing. Now, to the same doctor, it had become clear that, quote, "There is no doubt that a great part of the Indian's low resistance to tuberculosis is due to his abject poverty. Like most other social problems, this one is less medical than it is economic and educational." This was a profound insight. Finally, in 1936, when a man named Joseph Aronson began his work leading the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tuberculosis Control Unit, work that would last nearly 20 years and eventually make Aronson one of the world's leading experts on the BCG vaccine, he found racial susceptibility at the beginning of his work, compelling explanation. It was not until he begun what he called his trailblazing project of TB surveillance and vaccination that he even began, quote, to question the validity of the claim that the Indian is peculiarly susceptible to TB. 4 years later, in 1940, after surveying thousands of Indians on 4 reservations and in southeastern Alaska, he and his colleagues had concluded that social and economic conditions, or what they called at the time bionomic factors, were responsible for the high incidence of TB. He wrote, the establishment of slum areas in rural districts, rather than a peculiar racial susceptibility to the disease, they wrote, was responsible for high rates of infection. And so what happened over the course of particularly the 1930s, slowly but surely, was that explaining disease susceptibility rather to disease by exploring the link between poverty and disease, began to replace the link between race and disease. And again, this was an enormous transformation in the way people approached medicine. Now, this happened largely because research overtook assumptions. People had been guided for decades in their conclusions by their beliefs about race. Eventually, as people did more and more research on tuberculosis and began to show that these assumptions were incorrect, one explanation overtook another. Just really briefly, the slides that are up now, this first one is from an essay, not an essay, a research study funded by the British Medical Research Council, and what was then called Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania in East Africa, was a massive research project on how TB actually looked and worked in a population. And for the first time, this Dr. Charles Wilcox did mass X-ray surveys across East Africa and set up laboratories to actually do real research. And what you can see in the slides on the right-hand side, the fellow who's lying down on the ground and the car is propped up, is this mobile X-ray unit that Wilcox devised, whereby he's got the wheels of the car, I don't know if you can see it, slightly jacked up off the ground so that the back wheels are spinning. And he's using that gyroscopic force, it's really fascinating, to power this X-ray unit so that he can do X-rays in the field. This is a mobile X-ray unit. And out of all this work that was being done around the 30s, in the 1930s, is an enormous explosion. These are just a few of research on TB, particularly in Africa, but also a tremendous amount was done in India as well. Down here, tuberculosis in the Maori, to say nothing of the extraordinary amount of research being done on American Indians and First Nations in Canada. And these ideas that came out of this research exploded these assumptions about tuberculosis. One of the most prevalent assumptions that was overturned was that particularly American Indians and Black Africans were unable to resist tuberculosis. That is, if they were infected, they died. And what these X-ray surveys revealed, really, really interestingly, and I don't mean to be so technical about this, it sounds very small and perhaps inconsequential now, but what these X-ray surveys revealed was healed tuberculosis lesions on the chests of American Indians and Black South Africans. And what this meant was that Black South Africans and American Indians had been infected by tuberculosis, but had fought the infection. And you could see the evidence of this through the X-rays, healed tuberculosis lesions on their chests. And what this led doctors to conclude was, in fact, for the first time, that Black South Africans and American Indians were capable of fighting infection. But this wasn't known until mass X-ray surveys were done in the field. And these had not been done before people like Charles Wilcox and Joseph Aronson did these mass X-ray surveys. So this is an extraordinary example, in my view anyway, of when one set of ideas replaced another through research. Now, finally, on this point, is that even at a time when the natural causes of disease were being discovered. It was human ideas that explain why some got sick and others did not. We were in a period of extraordinary discoveries in medicine with the discovery of the disease-causing agents, tuberculosis, cholera, et cetera, and so forth. And it was a period of extreme medical advancement. But it's also very clear that ideas at the same time still had a profound effect. Now, finally, the final kind of element of infectious disease, and somewhat building on the last point, is that there has been what might be characterized as an irresponsible over-optimism concerning the power of biomedicine when it came to epidemics. This is particularly prevalent in the period from the end of the Second World War through the end of the 1970s. Overconfidence became especially prominent as the result of the laboratory revolution of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As I show the slides of movies and books and so forth, this notion of magic bullets and the power of biomedicine had seeped into American culture, particularly American culture. Now, while the discovery of DDT and antibiotics in the 1940s, with rather those discoveries, confidence in medicine only accelerated. It took on new momentum in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the so-called golden era of antibiotics. People even began to talk about the eradication of infectious disease. Now, none of this is to say that actual optimism was not warranted. The optimism associated with scientific medicine was real. If you look at these slides, you can just see that life expectancy was ever increasing, particularly in the United States. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, the discovery of antibiotics just increased exponentially. Selman Waxman wins the Nobel Prize for his discovery of streptomycin, which actually cures people of tuberculosis. In public pronouncements and in the mainstream press in the 1950s and 60s especially, there was buzz in the air about disease eradication and wonder drugs. They were just popping up left and right. This was the climate in which infectious disease specialist Aidan Coburn claimed in Science in 1961 that, quote, we can look forward with confidence to a considerable degree of freedom from infectious diseases at a time not too distant in the future. He went on to write a book about it, The Evolution and Eradication of Infectious Diseases. Some believe technology, medical technology, would foment the leap from so-called primitive society, so-called modern civilization. Walsh McDermott, who was a prominent TB and international health expert, noted in a lecture he gave at the National Institutes of Health in 1963 that biomedical research and interventions were crucial to what he called planned modernization. For McDermott and others, quote, purposeful modernization was the major social movement of our times. The biomedical goal of international development or purposeful modernization is to modify the disease pattern of an overly traditional society to a disease pattern that will not act as a major drag on a modernization effort. According to McDermott, because of antibiotics, the control of tuberculosis, in fact, is, quote, one of the few instances to date in which a major disease can be decisively altered without having to await improvement in the social infrastructure. Now, this is an extraordinary shift in thinking, and Walsh McDermott was a giant of TB work at this time. He's saying, unlike the writers I had just focused on in the 1930s, who recognized for the first time, really, especially amongst American Indians and Black South Africans, that social conditions were what were giving rise, in fact, to the amount of tuberculosis those populations were suffering from. McDermott is now saying that antibiotics will allow us to cure tuberculosis, to have a major impact on tuberculosis without having to improve the social infrastructure. Now, Walsh McDermott wasn't someone who was saying we shouldn't try to eradicate poverty, we shouldn't try to eradicate malnutrition. He was just trying to say that, in fact, we don't need to do these things first. We have antibiotics that will actually cure disease. In 1962, Fred Soper, who was famous for his efforts to eradicate malaria, declared that TB could be wiped off the face of the earth. When people finally accepted that tuberculosis was, quote, no longer a social and economic, but rather a public health and medical administrative problem, it could be done away with. William Stewart, who was the Surgeon General of the United States, is even said to have claimed in the 1960s, late 1960s, that, quote, "It is time to close the book on infectious diseases and declare the war on pestilence won." Now, of course, that's a radically oversimplified view of how infectious diseases work. Here's just some more charts showing the prevalence, or rather the decline in tuberculosis in many, many places. What you're also seeing, however, in these slides is the one I'm looking at on the upper left, is you can see that in 1940, beginning in like the 1940s, there's a little spike here in the middle of the 1940s, but really from about 1945, 1950, there's a steady decline in tuberculosis. And you also see that in the bigger slide here at the bottom, that in Japan, the US, UK, France, Netherlands, otherwise, US and Western Europe and Japan, that TB is declining rapidly. Now, what other charts have shown, and this is showing to a small degree, is that tuberculosis had been declining in populations before the discovery of antibiotics. And what you have here in the upper right-hand corner is the confluence of HIV and TB, and I'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. But what I'm showing is beginning in 1980. If you look across the chart, you see it's fairly steady. And this is in Africa. I'm sorry. That TB is fairly steady. When HIV comes along in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and steadily increases, it meets that HIV line in about 1994. And then the two accelerate together despite antibiotics. And so the point there is that despite the prevalence of antibiotics, you have an extraordinary increase in tuberculosis because of HIV. So a disease, TB, that was susceptible to antibiotics and actually curable, and one, according to Walsh McDermott, who you need not change the social conditions in order to treat it, in fact is exploding despite the presence of antibiotics, because people are ignoring the social conditions. And that, in a way, is an illustration of the dangerous way of thinking that Walsh McDermott embodied. So one final outrageous claim in this realm. In 1973, at the height of biomedical optimism, Frank McFarlane Burnett, who won the Nobel Prize in biology, Australian biologist, wrote in one of the most widely used textbooks in medical education, The Natural History of Infectious Disease. He wrote that one of the immemorial hazards of human existence is gone, because there is now a virtual absence of serious infectious disease today. He went on to imagine a world totally free of epidemic disease. Now, perhaps that day will come, but in 1973, when he wrote that, lurking and ready to take off, of course, was one of the most devastating infectious diseases in human history, HIV/AIDS. Now, the arrival of HIV/AIDS was the end of this age of optimism, over-optimism, the end of the age of hubris. Any bluster about the death of infectious disease by the hand of biomedicine, or the hope of living in a world free of pestilence, disappeared, as it became clear that HIV/AIDS was a new infectious disease, thriving in a world once thought, by some anyway, to be on the verge of being rid of such menaces. And now, of course, we're living in the midst of another global pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, which in many respects embodies all the themes that I've talked about. It is not a natural event. It is disproportionately affecting the poor. We have over-optimistic views of the power of biomedicine, and our ideas and our, excuse me, our fear of outsiders are enormously powerful in our effects, or rather our ability to fight this disease. So thank you very much for listening for the last 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so. I'm going to turn my camera back on, and I can so I can see everyone. You can see me, and I don't know if you want to stop screen sharing or not. I see that there's a lot of questions in the chat and so forth. And Nitin, I'm not sure how much time you want to take with questions, or if, I don't know that I can answer questions and look at the chat all at the same time. But how much time do we have to do some questions?
Professor McMillen, we have almost 10 questions in the chat box. So my students will read those questions to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir, for the thought-provoking and enlightening lecture. Now we will be moving on to the question-answer session. For the smooth conduct of the session, Nainu and myself will be reading out the questions simultaneously. So we will open today's Q&A session from the question by Manoj. The question is, you quoted someone defining disease as biological expression of sociological inequality. How do you see this statement in the light of diseases such as diabetes and obesity, which are generally viewed as diseases of the rich? What is your take on it, sir?
I'm sorry, the last diseases of what?
Diseases of the rich.
Oh, diseases of the rich. Okay. Well, obesity in the United States is, and I'm not qualified necessarily to talk about obesity in any great detail, but I can say in the United States anyway, that it's not a disease of the rich by any stretch of the imagination. It's more a disease of the poor because there's a lack of access to healthy food. There's a lack of access to adequate healthcare, exercise, and so forth. And so, but despite that, even if it were obesity historically has been thought of a disease of the rich, like gout, for example, has often been thought of as the king's disease, because it's an example of people who have, are great gluttons and so forth. But that's still a social explanation and a disease. And it could be, even if it goes in the opposite direction, like tuberculosis is emblematic of the disease of the poor. One could think of obesity as emblematic of a disease of the rich, and that still would be a biological expression of inequality. Inequality can go the other direction as well, towards wealth. I don't actually think, however, particularly in the United States, that disease, or rather obesity, is a disease of the rich. It's really a disease of the poor here.
So can we move on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay, this question is from Dr. Vandana Srivastava. How does science and technology see epidemics?
Good question. I think, in the last section of the talk, and I didn't go into as much detail in any of this as one could, but it's been my view as a historian. So as was clear in the introduction, I am a historian. I'm not a medical doctor. And so my approach is very much trying to understand things through, a humanistic perspective, really trying to understand how people have explained diseases to themselves, how people have tried to understand them from a social perspective. And it's been my experience in reading the history and then interacting with doctors today that there is a profound divide, frankly, between the way in which biomedicine has approached disease and the way in which humanists and historians and so forth have approached disease. That there is this sense that, the Walsh McDermott quote illustrates that with the presence of antibiotics, especially in the decades after they were discovered and perfected, that all we needed to do was apply technology equally around the world, and we would solve the problem of tuberculosis. But what what people like Walsh McDermott, who was really a giant and a humanitarian, and I don't mean to criticize him per se, but what people like he imagined was that we would be able to get tuberculosis antibiotics, which were profoundly important, almost miraculous medical technology, into people's bodies on an equal basis. What he didn't think about, was the unequal access to medicine, the difficulties of getting antibiotics to poor populations. He left that out of the equation. And so I think, there really needs to be at all times a profound realization of the fact that, for example, when we eventually get a COVID vaccine, that there's going to be unequal access to that vaccine. So the medical technology is only as good as is the supply chain, as is access to that medical technology. So theoretically, a COVID-19 vaccine will be wonderful, but in reality, it will only be as good as it is accessible.
Sir, we will move on to the next question.
Sure.
As the question is from Elsa Lalo. The question is, pandemics and epidemics killed thousands of people. They are a threat to human population. But there are people thinking that if human population rise to a great extent in underdeveloped countries, there will be wars like water wars. And some people think that epidemics and pandemics as positive threat. Sir, what is your opinion about it? Do you think underdeveloped countries are discriminated here?
Good question. I think that's a that's a really difficult and good question. I want to say first and foremost, no, I don't have a positive perspective on epidemics or pandemics as a, and I know the person asking the question isn't suggesting this, but that epidemics are a good way of population control, for example. I think where underdeveloped countries perhaps are discriminated against is that if you look at tuberculosis, which is the disease I know the most about, and HIV, but you could do the same with cholera and other diseases, and I didn't show this map. I show it often in my classes. I have a map of the way in which, where tuberculosis was most prevalent in the middle of the 19th century. It's a map from the late 19th century. And it shows that the tuberculosis was most prevalent, of course, in the United States and across Europe. And the rest of the world, India, for example, all of South Asia, most of Africa, was really a blank spot on the map when it came to tuberculosis. And then I show the students another map, a global map, where almost literally the opposite is true. And tuberculosis is most prevalent in Africa and in South Asia and in China. And the point, I suppose, is that the unequal conditions of development over the last century have resulted in the unequal prevalence of infectious disease in some countries and not others. And it's flipped entirely from the 19th century to the 20th century. So I think in a sense, maybe the answer to your question about underdeveloped countries being discriminated against could be true because of the conditions that have arisen from global inequality, global underdevelopment in some places, colonialism in others, has resulted in a prevalence of infectious disease in some places and not others, that all were sites of colonialism, for example. In the United States, we have a phenomenon, what many people will call internal colonialism, Indian reservations, for example, or extraordinarily underdeveloped urban centers in some places, which also happen to be the sites of the most prevalent places for COVID-19, for other kinds of infectious diseases. It's the same kind of pattern that I think your question is alluding to.
Thank you, Professor McMillen. Nikhil, is it all right if I ask a question in person?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor McMillen, for that talk. I teach literature here at the Department of English. And so I'm not particularly familiar with the methodology of the social sciences. So if you'll pardon me, my question to you is about the possibility of seeing epidemics as metaphor. I asked this also in the light of the upcoming US elections and how the COVID outbreak could consolidate certain xenophobic anxieties, because President Trump has famously and repeatedly called COVID-19 a China virus. So as a social scientist, how do you see this affecting the course of American and even world politics?
I'm sorry, say the last piece again.
As a social scientist, how do you see this affecting the course of American and even world politics?
Oh boy. Good question. You know, there's a lot of ways I could answer the Trump question. You know, honestly, I don't have a clear answer for you how it's going to affect American politics. In the very short term, it has thrown the country into, you know, not in every aspect, but it's thrown the country into politically into chaos. Frankly, we have an epidemic in this country that should not be as prevalent or as deadly or as controversial as it has become. In my view, the notion that people should wear masks has become a political statement. You know, the statement being, I'm not going to wear a mask because of X, or I'm going to wear it because of Y, is emblematic of our fractured politics here in the United States. As many people here have pointed out, everybody in this country virtually wears seatbelts, for example, in their automobiles. It's become ingrained in American life for decades and decades and decades. They're completely non-controversial. Everybody wears a seatbelt. I mean, occasionally you see people without seatbelts. But the vast majority of people driving around the United States you see wearing seatbelts. And they do it because it's safe. It's the right thing to do. If you get in a car accident with a seatbelt, you're much more likely to survive than if you don't have a seatbelt on. It's sort of obvious, right? And so many people ask, such as myself, well, why isn't it so obvious with masks? I mean, you know, what's the problem? Why not wear a mask? It's so obviously the right way to behave. It's so obviously the way to prevent yourself from getting COVID-19. But it's of course been politicized by all the way up through, as you know, through to President Trump, calling people who wear masks weak, suggesting they're ineffective, the disease isn't serious enough to warrant these kinds of interventions. And it's become a complete political divide on the left and the right between the ways different people approach COVID-19 here in the United States. So in the short term, what COVID-19 has done in the United States anyway, and it's likely similar elsewhere in the world, but I think I should limit my comments to the United States, has really done nothing more than just accelerate the divide between people here. It's tapped into things that were already present, divides that were already present, arguments that were already present, and it's, in my view anyway, heightened and accelerated them. That it's come in an election year and that President Trump has gotten sick only a month before the election has made the situation, political situation here even more chaotic than it was before. What that's going to mean and result in, I don't know. It is pretty concerning though. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's really changed on the one hand the political landscape because it's happened in an election year. At the same time, it's really just emblematic of the political divide that was already here. I think it's just accelerated it and heightened it.
Sir, we have the next question from Mr. Joshi Joseph. Epidemics are biological expressions of social inequality, you said. Aren't they also political opportunities for totalitarian regimes to consolidate their control over the people? Michel Foucault, in such works as Discipline and Punish, has analyzed how quarantine practices of the 17th century constituted a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism. Here in India, right now, we see how the pandemic has given the government an excuse to bypass the parliament and push through drastic changes in labor laws and agricultural regulations. What are your thoughts on the state misusing the helplessness of the people to further its own interests?
Yeah, good question. I think that's right. I mean, I think it can be both would be my answer. You know, they can be biological expressions of social inequality, as you say, also not one or the other. Also, opportunities for a totalitarian regime to consolidate power. I think that the way I've thought about epidemic diseases is while I think you're right, and I think that's absolutely possible. And some would argue, that the response to epidemic disease, like cholera and others in the 19th century, were ways for the state not only to consolidate its power, but also to display its power, whether through consolidation or just expansion. Rather, expansion and consolidation are kind of two sides of the same coin, I suppose. And one of the most obvious examples or most visible examples was the acceleration of and the widespread use of vaccination and resistance to vaccination, in the 19th century. I think my hesitancy not with the question, but with really thinking it through is that there are examples of what you're talking about, of totalitarian regimes or maybe governments that are inclined in that direction, using epidemics as times to consolidate power. And I think I'm sure you're entirely right about what's going on in India right now. Totalitarian regimes have also used many other circumstances and times to consolidate power. They need not have the presence of an epidemic disease to do so. So I mention that because I think that economic epidemics or biological expressions of social inequality is always true. That's always the state of affairs, that epidemics are always going to be, to a large degree, there are other things too, but they're always going to be biological expressions of social inequality. Whereas epidemics aren't always going to be an opportunity for totalitarian regimes to consolidate power. And also, I think that, totalitarian regimes are good at consolidating power without epidemics, depending on lots of other social conditions. So anyway, I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Professor Peter Thomas. The question is, history of epidemics in general shows that the poor were affected. It is true in a way. But COVID affects both the rich and the poor equally. President of America is no exception. It is the same even in India, with many ministers getting affected and even dead. The poor, interestingly, show more resistance. How do you comment on this situation?
No, that's a good point. You're right that there are many, like, in the United States, that we've seen, of course, the president, who one would have thought would have been one of the most isolated people on the planet, not much less the United States. I think what it demonstrates is that people like the president here, the members of Congress here who have become infected, are just as susceptible as anybody if they don't take the necessary precautions to protect themselves and others from the disease. I don't know whether that's the case in India. The people you mentioned, how and why they're getting COVID, if they're being, reckless or whatever. You're entirely right and it was the same point I was trying to make with disease. It's not that people who are wealthy are biologically unable to get the disease. If they put themselves in harm's way and they expose themselves to the disease, they are, of course, are just as at risk as others of getting the disease. And that's exactly what happened with President Trump and with several senators who recently have become infected. There was an event here in the United States, several events, where the president was at and various of these senators were at, and they were very much in close contact with one another. And one of the results was becoming infected with COVID-19. The point I was trying to make, and I don't think you're necessarily arguing with it, was that in the United States in particular with COVID, it's demonstrably true that more Black Americans, more Latino Americans, more American Indians have greater rates of COVID-19 than others, because they're the ones, like that quote from Marseille, France, that are least able to remove themselves from the dangerous conditions of infection. And so what I think that someone like President Trump getting COVID-19 reveals is not so much that it's that poor people are just as likely to get COVID-19. It's that rich people are just as likely. It's that rich people, powerful people who don't take precautions and don't keep themselves out of harm's way are just as likely to get COVID-19 as the poor are, who are unable to remove themselves from the conditions of harm. So in this country, it's the poor who are, working in Amazon warehouses, for example, where there have been 20,000 COVID cases because they're showing up for work every day around others who are infected. If we put, wealthy people working in Amazon warehouses, they would probably get COVID-19 also, but they don't need to do that. So I think you're absolutely right that wealthy people, powerful people are just as able to get COVID-19 as are the poor. But my point remains that it's the wealthy and the powerful who are more able to remove themselves from the conditions in which they are likely to get COVID-19. You could look at TB in the same way. There's a reason why tuberculosis became a much more prevalent disease in some places rather than others, and it's largely because people were able to remove the causes of infection. So I hope that answers your question. I agree that everybody is equally able to get disease. I just think not everyone's equally able to avoid it.
So do we have time for some more questions?
Yeah, let's do it. It's 9:20 a.m. here. Maybe you go for another 10 minutes or so. Is that good?
Okay, sir.
I see there's a lot of questions, so yeah.
The next question is from Mantri Venkata Raghuram. Decameron, Canterbury Tales, and Pious Plowman tells us about the illness, doctors, and death as it is related to COVID-19. Did you find any instances similar to migrant exodus and governmental sanctions of the present day in literature during plague?
I'm sorry, I missed that. It was about plague?
I'll read the last part once more. Did you find any instances similar to migrant exodus and governmental sanctions of the present day in literature during plague?
Yeah, let's see. Did you find anything? During the, so yeah, I see, yeah, okay. I see the question now in the migrant exodus and governmental sanctions at the present day. Yeah, yeah. If I'm understanding the question, which I think I do, it's so many of these patterns that we see now, yes, have been present in the past, and government sanctions or government government response, as well as migration, were enormous features, or prevalent features rather, of plague in the past. And so in Italy, for example, in the 17th century, when plague was quite prevalent, the government actually cracked down very explicitly on migration. And people had to have passes to travel from town to town, both in going two different ways. And what I mean by that is that, if there was an infection or an outbreak, an epidemic in a given region, people from that region would not be allowed to travel outside of their region for fear of spreading the plague. People who were from regions that were relatively free of plague would be given passes in order to travel. One of the most prevalent responses to plague was flight, was migration, in fact, was leaving the place where plague was most prevalent, which resulted in some of these travel restrictions. So flight during plague, migration, and then restrictions on migration and movement were responses to plague really from the beginning. I hope that answers your question.
Yes,
There's
sir.
a great novel that some of you may have read called, it's by Geraldine Brooks, and it's about, I think it's called The Plague Years. Forgive me if I've forgotten the exact name, but it's about a town in England in the 1640s or 50s. I could be wrong about the exact dates, where in fact, this restriction on travel is at really the heart of the novel, is that the town decides to isolate itself so that no one can come in or come out to keep plague from traveling out of the town. And they sort of, in a way, sacrifice themselves and restrict their own travel and out migration to preserve the health of those outside. Maybe time for one more question.
Yes, sir. The question is from Professor Vipin Cherian. And the question is, your reflection that viruses acquire meaning through human contact is getting a new dimension today. The coronavirus is getting its meaning out of the denial of its presence by many leaders, world leaders, including Trump and Bolsonaro. How do you see this? What is your take on the habit of seeing outsiders as responsible for such epidemics, even blaming mobile networks such as 5G for it? Could we hope for acceptance of reality either through science or such myths? Is there another window to open?
That's a great question. Actually, this has been really, all these questions have been really thought-provoking. This last one is one of the hardest to answer because what your question reveals is really in many respects at the heart of much of what I was saying. And it's such a challenge to try and understand how, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, people's beliefs still prevail. And so, I think back to when I was discussing race and tuberculosis, for example. Just very, very briefly, that for many people, that Lyle Cummins, who I mentioned, no matter how much evidence suggested to him that race had nothing to do with the prevalence of tuberculosis in a given population, he just wouldn't let it go. And I think there are always going to be those people who, regardless of the evidence, just won't let things go. And the tragedy of this is that sometimes those people are in power. And in the case of tuberculosis, Lyle Cummins was an example of this. For many years, he guided the South African government's policy in response to tuberculosis amongst its Black population, and therefore did nothing about tuberculosis because he believed that there was no way to treat tuberculosis amongst Black South Africans because evolution would really need to take care of the tuberculosis problem over a very long period of time. And the reason I'm reflecting back on that is because your question prompted it in my own mind, is that you've got someone like Trump, and you've got his legions of followers who will believe most anything he says, denying how important and how dangerous COVID-19 is. And in my view, the only way we're going to be able to move beyond that, because it doesn't seem like research to the contrary or arguments to the contrary are making a difference. The only way we're going to be able to mount an adequate response is when we're able to combine that research with the minds of people who are willing to accept it. And at some point, what you hope for, and this is what happened as I was trying to illustrate with tuberculosis, is that at some point what happens is, and this is sort of maybe obvious and maybe naive on my part, but what happens at some point is that the overwhelming amount of research changes enough minds so that there's a point at which you cannot go back to the old way of seeing things. And that's what happened with race and tuberculosis, is that it's not that everyone all of a sudden discounted race. It's that the overwhelming majority of researchers and tuberculosis workers abandoned this way of thinking. And I think that that's what's going to happen, around the world and in the United States, is that maybe now that President Trump has contracted COVID-19 and does appear to be in poor shape because of it, that he and his followers will take it seriously. I feel like I'm not giving a very satisfying answer to this excellent question, but the fact is you've latched on to one of the most difficult aspects of the history of epidemic and pandemic disease that we are all unfortunately living through right now, is that ideas and what people believe are extraordinarily important, if not the most important single element of the way pandemics play out in real and historical time. And the only thing I can say is that what we need is an overwhelming number of our political leaders, cultural leaders, to believe in the science and act accordingly. And I don't obviously see that happening. Not right now. As far as I know, you're not asking specifically about 5G networks, but I mean, I think like you've suggested, the range of explanations that are completely based in unreality are an extraordinary barrier to making progress against diseases like COVID-19. And it is unfortunately a pattern that has existed, as far back as blaming Jews, for example, for the plague in the 14th century, with no evidence. It's, as I showed the slides earlier of, vilifying Indian immigrants to England and the United States, thinking that the disease was solely the responsible of people coming from India or Muslim migrants. I mean, these ideas go back in time, and they come back with every new pandemic example.
So, do we have time for one more question?
Sure, just one more. Yeah.
Epidemics used to be in places underdeveloped, but Corona is an exception. It's affecting the developed the same way as the underdeveloped. Developed was affected first. Is COVID-19 different in its trajectory, unlike other epidemics?
Say the last part again.
Is COVID-19 different from its different in its trajectory, unlike other epidemics?
Oh, okay. The analogy, historical analogy that comes closest to mind is the 1918 flu pandemic. and plague, frankly, in early modern Europe, because as the person asking the question recognizes, is that it is affecting the developed world as much as it's affecting the undeveloped, underdeveloped, less developed, however we want to put it. I mean, all those terms have powerful meaning that I think many of us understand. They're not always the most descriptive, but the United States, for example, of course, is the most affected country in the world in terms of deaths per population. So yes, absolutely, it's affecting poor countries and rich countries as much as in patterns that are very different from diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. If we take a long-term view, however, what we see, so taking examples like malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, at one time, through the early 20th century, in the cases of TB and malaria and cholera, those diseases were still extremely prevalent in the United States and Great Britain and parts of Western Europe. Eventually, however, they became diseases of the less developed world for all the reasons that I talked about a little while ago. So over the long term, once the disease is not novel any longer, once it's been around for a while, if it does become endemic and then variously epidemic, if historical patterns are anything to go on, it will eventually move into more prevalently into the less developed world than in the wealthier nations. If long-term historical trends are to be followed. But at the moment, it's absolutely correct to say that there is no part of the world that seems to be less or more susceptible, other than countries like the United States who haven't taken it seriously. And that's the tragedy of it, is that this country, the United States, is one of the most capable in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its finances and so forth, of taking this disease seriously, and yet we have not. And that goes back to this, the question of ideas and values and so forth. The 1918 flu epidemic, or pandemic rather, is is both analogous to COVID and maybe now seemingly to be less and less so. And the reason I mentioned it a moment ago, and I'm coming back to it, is because, like the questioner asked, it affected every part of the world, if not equally, at least profoundly. And no country was really spared, poor, rich, or otherwise. And that, in many respects, is because at the time, the world, like now, was more and more connected through, not through air travel then, but through extraordinarily fast ship travel, but also troop movements and the internet connections because of the global economy in World War I. But also because of the virulence of the disease, it came and went so quickly, like flu does. It comes and goes very quickly. And so it never settled. It was an acute pandemic. It never settled into one country over another. That said, the places where it did have its most profound effects in terms of population were in poorer places rather than wealthy places. So whereas in the United States, about 700,000 people died, the best estimates of the death in India is between 15 and 25 million from the flu. The global figures are anywhere from 50 to 100 million. We just have so many blank spots in that data. I have no idea if that will be the path of COVID. But at the moment, you're absolutely right. It really seems to be affecting rich countries as well as poor countries, similar to the flu in 1918. And I think it's doing that for the same reasons that flu did at that time, because when it first appeared, there are no barriers to its transmission, rich or poor. It goes where it goes. And what we've seen, of course, in some of the wealthier countries like the United States is a poor response to it. So I'm hoping that answers your question. It's a bit of a rambling answer, but your observation is entirely correct.
Thank you, sir. Because of the time constraints, we have to wind up the Q&A sessions. Thank you, sir, for patiently answering our questions. We have many more interesting questions which will be sent to the speaker. Thank you all for your questions. We have a few more things before winding up. Over to you, Nikhil.
Yes, we can see that there is a sheer volume of questions that have almost stocked the chat box. That itself announces how engrossing your lecture was. So we have come to an end of today's lecture. There is a saying that the essence of all beautiful art is gratitude. To propose the vote of thanks, let me cordially invite Mr. Jerin B. Sebastian, Assistant Professor, St. Berkman's College. Over to you, sir.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you are.
Honorable chief guest of the webinar, teachers, research scholars, and participants from all over the world. Words of gratitude to the distinguished speaker of the day, Dr. Christian W. McMillen. The way in which you traced the trajectory of pandemics and epidemics in the course of history have been really insightful in assessing the contemporary global scenario. On behalf of the Department of English and all the participants, I convey our deep sense of appreciation and gratitude for this enlightening session. I thank Professor P.J. Thomas, head of the department, whose initiative has been instrumental in organizing programs with renowned academicians as keynote speakers. I acknowledge your unconditional support and guidance. I thank Professor Nidin Verghese, Professor Anish K. Joseph, Reverend Josh Jacob, who have been in the forefront, toiling day and night for organizing the entire webinar series. I would also like to thank all my colleagues in the department for your valuable suggestions and support. Nikhil, Nainu, Abhishek, and Toja Sebastian, our students, deserve special appreciation for comparing and our technical support, which really enhanced the quality of the webinar. My heartfelt gratitude to the participants from all over the world. Your very presence has helped in making this session a resounding success. I also acknowledge the roles and responsibilities everyone partook to make this event a successful one. Before I conclude, I request your presence in the 8th and final lecture of this international webinar series, which is scheduled on the 10th of October 2020. Dr. Sweda Anthony from the University of Delhi will deliver a lecture on the topic Edible Creature, an exploration of the representation of food in literature and popular culture. Thank you.
With that, we have come to the end of the session. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McMillen. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm really grateful. It was a great session, wonderful questions.
Thank you. I mean, I'll try to forward all those questions to you. So,
oh boy, okay.
they copied almost all the questions from the chat box.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Have a good day.
Yeah, it's still morning here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks
Bye, everyone.
for the department. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're very welcome.